On Wednesday, February 4th, 1846, Charles Shumway lined up his wagons and drove them to Kimball's Landing on the Mississippi River. On flatboats, his wagons and teams were ferried across the mile-wide river to the Iowa side and landed. Thus, Charles Shumway and his family became the first of some 15,000 Mormon pioneers to leave Nauvoo and begin the historic journey to the Rocky Mountains.
John Smith, uncle of the prophet Joseph Smith, wrote of the difficulties this move presented.
After making every preparation in our power with our scanty means, we collected our family and commenced crossing the river, being very cold with large quantities of ice running on the river.
Bathsheba W. Smith, wife of Apostle George A. Smith, wrote,
On the 9th of February, 1846, in company with many others, my husband took me and my 2 children and some members of his family, the remainder to follow as soon as the weather would permit, and we crossed the Mississippi to seek a new home in the wilderness. Thus we left a comfortable home, the accumulation and labor of 4 years. We took with us clothing, bedding, and provisions, leaving everything else for our enemies. It would be vain to describe how we traveled through snow, wind, and rain, how roads had to be made, bridges built, and rafts constructed, how our poor animals had to drag on day after day with scanty food, and how we suffered from poverty, sickness, and deaths. But the Lord was with us. His power was manifest daily.
The saints left way too early, weeks too early, for anybody going west. They were inexperienced. They'd never had much experience moving masses of people. The very weather conspired against them. This was the beginning of up to 70,000 Mormons that went to their new Zion in Utah. It was also the beginning of 6,000 graves. Graves that, if they had been spaced regularly along 1,300 miles from Nauvoo to Salt Lake, the pioneers would never have been out of a sight of a grave.
Despite the difficulties, the saints had at least a fairly clear understanding of where they were going. 4 years earlier, on August 6, 1842, Joseph Smith had prophesied that the saints would be driven to the Rocky Mountains.
Anson Call, who heard this prophecy, wrote,
With a tumbler of ice water in Joseph's hand, he prophesied that the saints would yet go to the Rocky Mountains, and said he, This water
tastes much like that of the crystal streams that are running from the snow-capped mountains.
He seemed absorbed in gazing at something at a great distance, and said,
Oh, the beauty of those snow-capped mountains. The cool, refreshing streams that are running down through those mountain gorges.
Then, gazing in another direction, as if there was a change of locality,
Oh, the scenes that this people will pass through. The dead that will lay between here and there.
Then, turning in another direction, as if the scene had again changed,
Oh, the apostasy that will take place before my brethren reach that land. But the priesthood shall prevail over its enemies, triumph over the devil, and be established upon the earth, never more to be thrown down.
During the last 2 years of Joseph's life, he spoke regularly of sending an exploring party west to the mountains, and after his death, the theme continued to be preached by Brigham Young and others. The brethren were quite familiar with the writings and maps of John C. Fremont and other explorers of the western lands, and all were confident that they would end their journey in some secluded valley in the Rocky Mountains, where they would be at peace to worship as they chose.
Though late winter seemed a poor time for the Saints to be setting out on what would become a 2-year, nearly 1,500-mile journey, they felt they had no choice. Not only had mobs commenced new depredations against the outlying citizens of Nauvoo, but Illinois Governor Thomas Ford had written that United States President James Polk was raising up at least 2 regiments of the regular army to arrest Brigham Young and the rest of the brethren, and to stop the Saints from departing to some area outside the nation.
However, as it turned out, this was a pack of lies. In his History of Illinois, published 8 years later, Ford himself wrote,
"With a view to hasten the Mormons' removal, they were made to believe that the president would order the regular army to Nauvoo as soon as the migration opened in the spring. This had its intended effect. The 12, with about 2,000 of the followers, immediately crossed the Mississippi before the breaking up of the ice."
The weather in February of 1846 was cold and unsettled, but not cold enough to freeze the river. Those crossing had to deal not only with the normally turbulent water and treacherous blocks of ice from upstream, but with other problems as well. 28-year-old Erastus Snow wrote,
"When I crossed my teams over the river, through the carelessness of the boatmen, the wagon containing our bedding, clothing, and groceries, and all our most valuable articles, was capsized into the water, wetting our goods and spoiling much, and well nigh drowning my oldest child that was in the wagon at the time. But I made the best of the matter, and felt thankful it was no worse."
On the other side of the treacherous river, the Saints began their trek across Iowa. Leaving what is now known as Riverfront Park in Montrose, they followed a 6-mile track of mud leading to Sugar Creek. There, they camped and awaited Brigham Young, who arrived on the 15th. He spent the next 2 days organizing the camp and comforting the hundreds of Saints who were milling anxiously about, doing little but worrying. Finally, in desperation, he called the camp together and preached a sermon.
"I wish the brethren to stop running to Nauvoo, hunting, fishing, idling away their time, and fix nose baskets for their horses, and save their corn, and fix comfortable places for their wives and children to ride, and never borrow without asking leave, and be sure to return what was borrowed. We will have no laws we cannot keep, but we will have order in the camp. If any want to live in peace when we have left this place, they must toe the mark."
On the 18th, the weather turned bad, with wind, rain, and snow as the cold increased.
It snowed daily after that, and the temperature dropped lower and lower. On the 24th, Brigham Young reported,
"The cold has been severe the past night. Thermometer 12 degrees below zero. Mississippi River frozen over above Montrose. Captain Charles C. Rich arrived from Nauvoo and reported that he had walked over the Mississippi River on the ice at Montrose."
Although the suffering among the encamped Saints was greater because of the cold, they rejoiced together because those left behind in Nauvoo could more easily and safely cross the ice-covered river. All considered this to be a providential blessing.
By March 1st, the weather had moderated. The majority of the Saints who were planning to go west that year had left Nauvoo, and all of the church leaders were in camp. Therefore, Brigham Young put out word that the camp of Israel should move forward. George A. Smith wrote,
"At about 2 o'clock, we were on the march with about 400 or 500 wagons. The day was warm and beautiful for the season, We traveled 5 miles and camped for the night.
After a week of travel through cold weather, storms, and mud, the camp of Israel straggled onto Richardson's Point, 55 miles northwest of Nauvoo. Here, they camped for a few days, resting themselves and obtaining what supplies they could from the neighboring farms.
Every type of wheeled vehicle imaginable could be found among the saints. Buckboards, buggies, farm wagons, and carriages. While some of these were uncovered, most had canvas covers that could be closed at the ends, offering some protection from the weather. Though oxen were preferred for pulling these conveyances, the saints also drove teams of horses and mules. None of these animals pulled at the same speed, and several saints did not even have teams at all for some of their wagons.
Therefore, there was no real order of march across Iowa. People took whatever trails looked most likely or least muddy, and they left camp early or late, depending on if they had teams and were ready to travel. And they stopped again whenever they felt they had endured enough for that day. Gradually, Brigham tried to bring order out of this chaos, pulling on his experience with Zion's camp in 1834, as he organized them into 10s, 50s, and 100s, appointing captains of each.
Yet problems continued, primarily because the continually moving camp was scattered all the way from the Mississippi to wherever Brigham was, and it was impossible to give them all a sense of divine community. Of course, the saints struggled with many other difficulties as well. Eliza R. Snow reported,
"We had been preceded from Nauvoo by thousands, and I was informed that on the first night of the encampment, 9 children were born into the world. And from that time, as we journeyed onward, mothers gave birth under almost every variety of circumstances imaginable, except those to which they had been accustomed. Some in tents, others in wagons, in rainstorms, and in snowstorms."
Illness and accidents were all too common on the trail, as you could expect. There was mumps, and there was measles, and there was erysipelas, and there was every known fever. Accidents were caused by all kinds of things, especially the draft animals. The women in the totally inappropriate dress of that day, their long skirts, which fashion and modesty decreed. Often those long skirts would get caught in wagon chains or in the spokes of the wagons, and they could be drawn under. An ox only moves about 2 miles an hour, but you can't stop an ox. There's no reins, and even if they were, they wouldn't do any good. So if you got anywhere near under an ox or under a wagon, it generally spelled death or disaster. And not only were there oxen, and not only were there wagons weighing tons, but there were little critters, there were little things that made life miserable, like bed bugs and ticks and lice and mosquitoes and gnats. Everything in God's green world that could plague the saints, I'm afraid, did at times. And then on top of that, as if disease and accidents and pests weren't enough, there was, of course, the terrible strain of people under stress, day after day, week after week, month after month. And this did come out. The saints were very human.
Emigrants, especially children, frequently wandered away from the slow-moving trains and got lost. Most found their way back, sometimes with the aid of Indians. But some were never seen again, their heartbroken families being forced to go on without them.
The pioneers faced many sad events on the trail. Some of them, of course, were the funerals and the burials. They're sad under any circumstances. Sometimes there were short, formal funerals, but most of the time the funerals were left to perform in the valley. The burials took place along the trail. Sometimes the ground was so hard and rocky, there were very shallow graves. And as far as coffins are concerned, there are stories of a few real coffins, but most people were buried in only a blanket or between pieces of bark or in a hollow log. And some of the little pioneers were buried in bread boxes. One was even buried in a dresser drawer. The weather seemed to conspire. Every known brand of weather was out here, including snow and ice and sun and mud and dust and winds. Whirlwinds so strong at times they could lift a child up. One child was lifted up and dumped in the Platte River, for example. Lips got sore, eyes were sore from dust. It could be very difficult, but they pushed on. They had to. They really didn't have much choice. And then, thirdly, there was the question of privacy. The women bathed when they could at night in the streams. The men bathed once a week, whether they needed it or not. And human elimination, that is a very real concern then and now. Naturally, every wagon had a chamber pot. The standard rule of the day, however, was ladies to the left, gents to the right. The sisters would go, several sisters, and they would spread their skirts into privacy screens, protecting each other. And that's the old trailside way of solving that problem.
But for the Saints in 1846, wet weather became the greatest obstacle of all. Sudden melting snows, almost constant rain, swollen creeks, interminable mud, and violent wind all took their toll.
So many wagons mired in the mud that travel was reduced to less than half a mile per day. 17-year-old Helen Mar Whitney, eldest daughter of Heber C. Kimball, wrote,
"The road after Shoal Creek lay over a prairie, and the earth being soft and inundated with the previous rains, all that could were obliged to walk to favor the poor animals. Our feet would sink into the deep mud at every step, and some of us came near being minus of shoes. As for umbrellas, they were rare articles, and we had the cold, pitiless rain beating down upon us all the way, till we were chilled and shaking with the cold."
On Sunday, March 22nd, the main camp reached the Sheraton River about 100 miles west of Nauvoo and encamped on the west bank. The weather was cold, the ground wet, and throughout the day there were intermittent showers.
The weather continued so bad that Brigham felt it best to hold the camp in place, so they stayed, living in a deepening sea of mud. Erastus Snow wrote,
Quickly, the mud in our camp became intolerable. We, however, peeled bark, gathered brush, and split out puncheon to lay down in our tents and about our doors and fireplaces. When we wished to go to our neighbors or see our teams, we forded the seas of mud and congratulated each other on the prospects before us.
On the 5th of April, with mud so deep in the camp on the Sheraton that they could endure it no longer, and with the first clear day in a week to cheer them on, the Saints pulled out. However, on April 6th, Hosea Stout wrote,
"This was of all mornings the most dismal, dark, and rainy after such a fine day as yesterday was. This day capped the climax of all days for traveling. The road was the worst that I have yet witnessed. The horses had sometimes sink to their bellies on the ridges. Teams stalled going downhill. We worked and toiled more than half the day, and had at last to leave some of our wagons and double teams before we could get through."
That night, a gale blew down Hosea's tent, as well as numerous others. And the next morning, there was snow on the ground. Most of their bedding was wet and frozen, and the creek was rising so fast they could not cross it. And Brigham Young, with wry humor, wrote the next day,
We passed through only one mud hole today, which was about 6 miles in length.
Yet the saints pressed on, mile after miserable mile. Patty Sessions, a pioneer midwife, later recorded.
In the night, it began to lightning and thunder, and the rain came faster than ever. About 6 o'clock in the morning, I was called to go back about 2 miles. I rode behind the man who came for me, through mud and water, some of the way belly deep to the horse. I found the sister I was called to see, alone in an old log cabin. Her child was born before I got there. She rode 13 miles after she was in travail and crossed the creek on a log after dark.
On April 15th, the camp reached Locust Creek near the present Iowa-Missouri state line. There, as a discouraged William Clayton contemplated the dreary prospect ahead, word got through from Nauvoo that his plural wife Diantha had given birth to a healthy baby boy. Walking out on the prairie to express his gratitude to the Lord, William suddenly found his mind filled with the hopeful words of a new song, which he entitled All Is Well.
Come, come, ye saints, no toil nor labor fear, but with joy wend your way.
When visiting the Locust Creek area today, one can still feel the joy and reverence that William Clayton must have felt in 1846. The wide expanse of the prairie is almost untouched by modern society, except for this small marker commemorating the event which took place here.
At Locust Creek, Brigham and the other brethren finally admitted that there was little hope of the entire camp reaching the Rocky Mountains before winter. Therefore, it was decided that a small force would push rapidly onward to the mountains, while the majority would go more slowly, planting crops for the poorer saints who were still to follow, strengthening the livestock, and preparing temporary shelters in which to pass the coming winter.
On April 24th, after more terrible days on the trail, they reached a place they called Garden Grove, about halfway across Iowa. Here, speaking to the gathered camp, Brigham said,
I am reduced in flesh, so that my coat, that would scarcely meet around me last winter, now laps over 12 inches. I can hardly keep from lying down to wait the resurrection.
With virtually everyone in the camp of Israel in such condition, it was determined that Garden Grove would be a good place for most of the camp to stop and establish a farm. Within 3 weeks, about 715 acres of tough prairie sod had been broken and planted. Several cabins had been built, and a high council had been called to regulate the affairs of the place.
This is Garden Grove. It was the settlement of the Mormons, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint people, in 1846. In this area right here, we have the cemetery, and we're not definite on how many people were buried here. The graves have long since disappeared because the land was farmed at one time. This area has been made into a county conservation park known as the Trailside Historical Park. And in the background is a monument erected by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints commemorating the site and the cemetery at Garden Grove.
Not far from this monument at Garden Grove, the actual campsite of the pioneers was recently rediscovered by the property owners, Mr. and Mrs. Paul Gunzenhauser. Here, the layout of each cabin site can be easily distinguished. It is apparent that common walls were a necessity, not only because of the lack of timber, but to conserve heat as well. The mowed path marks the actual Mormon trail on which the pioneers traveled. Because of the lack of timber at Garden Grove, explorers were sent out to scout other locations. Parley P. Pratt located some grassy hills crowned with beautiful groves of timber some 25 miles northwest of Garden Grove. Referring to the mountain from which Moses saw the promised land, he called the place Mount Pisgah.
Meanwhile, on the last day of April, a group of faithful saints who had not yet left Nauvoo gathered in the temple and dedicated it to the Lord. The next day it was publicly dedicated, with Orson Hyde offering the dedicatory prayer.
Wilford Woodruff, who had just returned from England, was in attendance and recorded,
"Notwithstanding the many false prophecies of Sidney Rigdon and others that the roof should not go on, nor the house be finished, and the threats of the mob that we should not dedicate it, yet we have done both."
This was apparently the last official meeting held by church leaders in the Nauvoo Temple.
Back in Iowa, the majority of the camp was en route to Mount Pisgah, and there Brigham Young organized another high council and established another way station for the saints.
Several thousand acres were plowed, fenced, and planted to peas, cucumbers, beans, corn, buckwheat, potatoes, pumpkins, and squash. And several hundred cabins were built. Both of these way station farms at Garden Grove and Mount Pisgah were operated by the church from 1846 to 1852. At its height, Mount Pisgah had over 2,000 inhabitants, most staying until their future homes in the Rocky Mountains were more certain. There is little left today of the old campsite at Mount Pisgah, but in 1888, the saints erected a monument here honoring their dead who rest in the adjacent cemetery.
Feeling impressed to move ahead, Brigham and most of the other leaders left Mount Pisgah on June 1st, and by June 14th had traveled 100 miles, reaching the Missouri River.
Brigham Young and the saints had been nearly 4 months in traveling across Iowa, a distance of only 264 miles. Their speed over the last 100 miles was because they had enjoyed the unfamiliar luxury of dry trails and abundant grass. Although the trek across Iowa was challenging, to say the least, visible evidence of the actual Mormon Trail in Iowa is virtually non-existent today, except for this quarter-mile of trail ruts near the Mormon Trail Park in Adair County.
Temporary headquarters were established at Mosquito Creek on Potawatomi Indian land in the Missouri bottoms, and the brethren went to work building landings and a boat to ferry their wagons across the Missouri. Still, 2 issues remained unresolved. Since they were on Indian lands, where would they winter on the Missouri? And was there still time for some of the group to press on to the west before the onset of winter storms? Both of these issues were resolved in a way that no one could have anticipated.
On April 24th, the same day that the saints reached Garden Grove, armed forces from Mexico engaged in conflict with the United States in a dispute over the boundary between the two countries, and several Americans were killed. On May 11th, war was declared by Congress, and soon General Zachary Taylor was achieving victory after victory against the Mexican forces.
Meanwhile, Meanwhile, Elder Jesse C. Little, who was presiding over the affairs of the church in the East, had been instructed to embrace any facilities offered by the government for the saints emigrating to the West.
Thomas L. Kane, a 24-year-old sickly youth who was also a colonel in the U.S. Army, befriended Elder Little. At Colonel Kane's instigation, Elder Little visited with President James K. Polk, who manifested a friendly disposition toward the saints and offered to enlist between 500 and 1,000 of them in the Army to assist them in going west, if they would engage in the conflict with Mexico along their way. Elder Little felt impressed to accept this proposal.
The emigrating saints first learned of this proposal on June 26th, when Captain James Allen of the 1st Dragoons arrived at Mount Pisgah to begin raising what was to become known as the Mormon Battalion. Immediately he issued a circular to the Mormons which stated that he had come to accept the services for 12 months of 4 or 5
companies of the Mormon men who may be willing to serve their country for that period in our present war with Mexico.
Of course, the Mormons were immediately suspicious of this official representative of the government that had just evicted them from their homes. Wilfred Woodruff was sent on to Council Bluffs to warn Brigham Young. And Hosea Stout, whose 3rd child to die on the plains had passed away that very morning, wrote,
"We were all very indignant of this requisition, and only looked on it as a plot laid to bring trouble on us as a people. For in the event that we did not comply with the requisition, we supposed that they would now make a protest to denounce us as enemies of our country. And if we did comply, that they would then have 500 of our men in their power to be destroyed, as they had done to our leaders at Carthage."
After meeting with Captain Allen at Council Bluffs, Brigham and the other leaders quickly concluded that his visit was the result of Elder Little's efforts.
With the approval of Brigham and the other apostles, recruiting began immediately and continued for 3 weeks, until 5 companies of 100 men each were finally organized. Several women were also recruited as laundresses and cooks.
On July 16th, they were mustered into service, and on the 18th, a farewell ball was held in their honor. There, Brigham promised the soldiers that if they conducted themselves properly, they would not have to fight.
Finally, at noon on Tuesday, July 21st, 1846, the Mormon Battalion began its historic march toward Fort Leavenworth and the far west. William Hyde, one of the battalion members, recorded his feelings as he departed.
"The thoughts of leaving my family at this critical time are indescribable. They were far from the land of their nativity, situated upon a lonely prairie with no dwelling but a wagon, and the scorching sun beating upon them with the prospect of the cold winds of December, finding them in the same bleak and dreary place."
By encouraging 5 companies to join, the brethren realized they would not have sufficient manpower to continue any further west that year. Once the battalion had gone, the brethren sent out exploring parties to find the best possible location for a permanent winter settlement. After much searching, it was concluded that the west side of the Missouri River, where they then were, was as good a spot as could be found. From the Potawatomi Indians, they obtained written permission to remain on their lands until they could journey westward.
Shortly thereafter, the short-lived Cutler's Park was established. Today, there is no evidence of the many saints who once camped here. Once the actual winter quarters camp was chosen, Cutler's Park was abandoned. In the winter quarters area, several historical sites and markers still remain commemorating the Mormon cemetery and the old Mormon mill, as well as winter quarters itself. Many street signs still reflect the Mormon influence in the area.
Meanwhile, on July 31st, the ship Brooklyn arrived in San Francisco Bay. After setting sail from New York on February 4th with 230 Mormons under the leadership of Samuel Brannan, the Brooklyn stopped just twice on its 6-month journey around Cape Horn to California.
Although they originally planned to stop at Valparaiso to replenish their supplies of wood, water, and food, a massive storm sent them off course, rendering it impossible. Instead, they stopped at the Juan Fernandez Island of Robinson Crusoe fame, where they were blessed to obtain as much wood and water as they could possibly want for free.
The miraculous landing on this beautiful tropical paradise also provided an abundance of fresh fruit, which was badly needed to cure the terrible outbreak of scurvy on board ship.
On June 25, 1846, the Brooklyn made its second stop in Honolulu Bay, the island of Oahu in the Sandwich Islands. Despite the need to rest and once again replenish food and water supplies, this stop was also necessary as the Brooklyn carried much freight which was to be discharged there.
The Mormons were surprised to find such friendly and pleasant natives, and soon discovered that Protestant missionaries had been proselyting here for many years before their arrival. In fact, it wasn't too many years later in 1850 when some of the natives embraced Mormonism, and the first Mormon church was built on the island of Maui, Hawaii.
George Q. Cannon, who was instrumental in establishing this church here on Maui, received a special witness of its divine importance. While he was visiting a baptismal pond in the hills behind this chapel, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ appeared to him, thus confirming the truthfulness of the gospel.
Upon their arrival in California, the passengers of the Brooklyn became the first saints to set foot in California. W.N. Austin, a child at the time, wrote,
"When the word came to go west, my father sold everything, and we went with the saints on the Brooklyn. I wish to say that the Brooklyn was a good, strong vessel, although statements have been made to the contrary. She weathered 2 of the worst storms that ever beset the Horn, and I remember that Captain Richardson said that if the ship had not been a good one, she would never have come through. I remember when we landed on the island of Juan Fernandez. The island was a penal colony of the Chilean government at the time, and we went ashore for wood and water and stayed 5 days. We landed again at Honolulu, where we stopped for a week or 2 securing supplies and fresh water for the last leg of our trip. We finally reached San Francisco, or Yerba Buena as it was called. Some of the families moved to the Mission Dolores, and some went to farm in the San Joaquin Valley. The farm was a cooperative affair and failed. Brannan got everything.
Back in Nauvoo, opponents of the church, realizing that not all of the Mormons would be gone by summer, resorted once again to persecution and mobocracy. Men and women harvesting grain were attacked and severely beaten. By mid-August, less than 1,500 saints remained in Nauvoo, some of them new converts from the east, and all of them too poor to continue. Nevertheless, the mobs demanded their departure. By mid-September, approximately 800 men equipped with 6 cannons prepared to lay siege to the city to drive the people out. About 150 Mormons and new citizens went to defend themselves, and their engagement became known as the Battle of Nauvoo.
For 6 days there were skirmishes, attacks by the mob, and spirited counterattacks led by Daniel H. Wells. Then the Quincy Committee worked out a peace proposal which required that all but 5 men and their families surrender unconditionally and depart immediately across the Mississippi. The remaining 5 would attempt to dispose of the property left behind by the fleeing saints. Those who could crossed the river immediately without provisions or extra clothing.
Finally, the mob entered the city, looted homes, and desecrated the temple. Thomas Bullock wrote,
On the 17th, 2,000 men with 500 wagons marched into the city. But such yelling, hooting, howling I never heard from men, or even the wild savages of the forest. Terror and dismay overcame the sick, the poor, women, and children. Such an awful and infuriated noise I never heard. I, with others who were sick, were carried into the tall weeds and woods, while all who could hid themselves. Many crossed the river, leaving everything behind. Oh, God, what a night to remember.
Soon, refugee camps of 500 to 600 people each, including those who had been left as too sick to travel, were scattered along the riverbank above Montrose, Iowa. Some starved to death there, and others perished from exposure.
On October 9th, when starvation had become widespread, several flocks of quail flew into camp. Hundreds of them were caught and eaten by the hungry saints, who looked upon the experience as a sign of God's mercy to modern Israel.
Shortly thereafter, a mercy mission arrived from winter quarters to help them move west. And when word of the Battle of Nauvoo reached Brigham Young, he immediately dispatched a second mercy mission. Throughout the fall, the nearly 12,000 Latter-day Saints scattered across Iowa prepared for winter the best they could. The hasty, wintry exodus from Nauvoo earlier in the year, the horrible, constantly wet trek across Iowa, insufficient provisions, inadequate shelter, the forced exodus of the poor from Nauvoo, and unhealthy riverbank environments all contributed, and sickness and disease took a heavy toll.
During the summer, many suffered from malaria, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Later, there was an outbreak of scurvy, which they called black canker, and many other diseases. According to Mariah Pulsifer, only about 1 in 6 children survived these illnesses. Hundreds died. Wilford Woodruff also wrote,
I have never seen the Latter-day Saints in any situation where they seem to be passing through greater tribulations or wearing out faster than at the present time.
And he was right. Over 700 people died during that first winter. Unfortunately, very few graves were marked along the Mormon Trail due to time constraints as well as other things. However, Rebecca Winter's grave, which can be found near Scottsbluff, Nebraska, is one of the few known grave sites of the approximately 6,000 Mormons who died crossing the plains. It was discovered in 1899 by Burlington Railroad surveyors, who changed the right-of-way to protect the grave.
Brigham encouraged the 22 wards at winter quarters and all the saints elsewhere to hold feasts and dances at least weekly to help alleviate their suffering and lift their spirits. There were also church meetings twice a week and other social events such as quilting, knitting, washing clothes, combing and braiding each other's hair, reading, and planning for the spring.
Many of the saints also discovered that their trials and difficulties were actually increasing their faith. They became more and more able to call down the blessings of heaven on themselves and loved ones. Robert Gardner Jr. recorded a personal experience at winter quarters.
My brother Archie and myself and James Craig, one of the pioneers, got out the timbers for the grist mill. I'd done the hewing with a broad axe. While doing so, I was taken with fever and ague one day. I went home and went to bed and was crazy all the next day. But when Archie and Craig come home, they come and administered to me. The next morning, I was well and at work again, and kept so until we started west.
On Thursday, January 14, 1847, Brigham dictated what came to be known as Section 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the word and will of the Lord concerning the camp of Israel in their journeyings to the west.
Let each company provide themselves with all the teams, wagons, provisions, and other necessaries for the journey that they can. Let each company, with their captains and presidents, decide how many can go next spring. Then choose out a sufficient number of able-bodied and expert men to take teams, seeds, and farming utensils, to go as pioneers to prepare for putting in spring crops. Let each company bear an equal proportion in taking the poor, the widows, the fatherless, and the families of those who have gone into the army. Let every man use all his influence and property to remove this people to the place where the Lord shall locate a stake of Zion.
This stirring revelation became the only revelation included in the Doctrine and Covenants that was given through Brigham Young.
After the long, hard winter at winter quarters of 1846-47, spring finally arrived. And on or about April 15th, it was time to get the pioneer group ready to roll. There were originally to be 144 men, presumably 12 for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. This got changed a little bit, and we ended up with 143 men, 3 women, 2 children, 121 draft animals, 72 wagons, some chickens, and a handful of dogs. And they were ready to go. Now, the leaders knew that this was a pioneer group, and by definition, they handpicked every man. So we had carpenters, and we had cowboys, and we had dairymen, and we had all kinds of people with all kinds of talents. They weren't all Mormons, incidentally, and there were 3 black slaves. And all of this great mass of humanity was kind of like the church today, a cross-section of humanity. And the proof of the pudding is they made it. It took them 111 days, and the worst they had to put up with was they lost 4 horses by accident.
On Sunday, April 4th, 1847, Tarleton Lewis and Stephen H. Goddard arrived on the Elkhorn River to build a raft in expectation of the arrival of the pioneers.
The next day, Heber C. Kimball's 3 wagons pulled out and traveled 3 miles before camping. And every day after that for a week, a few more left for the staging area a few miles west. The staging area, also known as Mormon Pioneer Campsite, is currently marked with this monument, which commemorates the Mormon pioneers' exodus across Nebraska. Elder George A. Smith, then 30 years old, wrote,
Took leave of my family and started for my camp about 9:00 a.m. Left my youngest child, Nancy Adelia, with inflammation of the brain. It was the opinion of most that she would not live but a few hours. 2 others of my family were also sick. I left cornmeal enough to last my family 3 days, but no other provisions.
Later, Elder Smith learned that his little daughter had indeed passed away 2 days after his departure and was buried in the cemetery at winter quarters.
The next day, Brigham called the camp together and organized them into a very military-like expedition. Willard Richards wrote,
At 5 o'clock, the bugle is to be sounded as a signal for every man to rise and attend to prayers before he leaves his wagon. Then, cooking, eating, feeding teams, and so forth till 7 o'clock, at which time the camp is to move at the sound of the bugle. Each teamster is to keep beside his team with his loaded gun in his hands or in his wagon, where he can get it in a moment. The extra man, each to walk opposite his wagon with his loaded gun on his shoulder, and no man be permitted to leave his wagon unless he obtains permission from his officer. The order of encampment is to be a circle, with the horses and stock tied inside the circle. At 8:30 p.m., the bugle is to be sounded again, at which time all are to have prayers in their wagons and retire to rest by 9 o'clock.
Succeeding companies were organized in much the same way. But even though the trek was now carefully organized, it did not eliminate difficulty, tragedy, and suffering.
About this time, we were having very warm weather, so much that we women got very sunburned. We had sand and dust, rocks and hills to pass over, and sometimes we were very worn out and tired. But not so much as our brethren, who had to walk most of the time, drive teams, and stand guard at night.
Whenever possible, the pioneers followed existing roads and trails, doing very little actual trailblazing. Through Nebraska and on to Fort Laramie, they stayed north of the Platte River, paralleling the Oregon Trail, which was on the south of the river.
I'm standing here by the Platte River in central Nebraska. The Mormons followed it for about 700 miles, making it therefore the largest single natural feature on the entire Mormon Trail or Oregon Trail or any other Great Western Trail. It's extremely important. This river offered the pioneers the one vital thing that made going west possible: water. Maybe not very clean water, and when they drank it, they kept their teeth closed to screen out the biggest wiggly things. The little wiggly things went through, but they just had to put up with that.
On April 19th, William Clayton, who was counting each revolution of a measured wheel to determine the miles traveled, suggested to Orson Pratt the idea of fixing up a set of
wooden cog wheels to the hub of a wagon wheel in such order as to tell the exact number of miles traveled each day.
Nothing more was said until May 10th, when Brigham Young suggested to Orson Pratt that such a machine be developed. And by May 12th, using Orson's directions, William Clayton and Appleton Harmon had finished what they called the road meter. Attached to the rear axle of William Clayton's wagon, it freed him so he would only need to count the number of miles each day, rather than the number of revolutions of the wheel. The ingenious road meter was developed and tested just west of the Sand Hill Ruts near southern Nebraska.
These are the famous Sand Hill Ruts. Perhaps I should say the infamous Sand Hill Ruts. Much of Nebraska is composed of sand hills, and for many, many miles, the Mormons had been following the trail between the Platte River and between these sand hills. However, at this particular point, as you can see, the bluffs come right down to the river. There was no way to outflank them. There was no way to go left or right. They simply had to pull this huge sand hill you see behind me. So they pulled it. It was terrible for the oxen. The oxen usually went 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but there was no other way. And as you can see, coming down the hill, there are various sets of ruts, a very nice set over there, and one directly behind me.
While the journey was much easier than the route across Iowa had been the year before, it was difficult for Brigham to keep the saints on a righteous plane. Brigham declared,
"Give me the man of prayers. Give me the man of faith. Give me the man of meditation, a sober-minded man. And I would far rather go amongst the savages with 6 or 8 such men than to trust myself with the whole of this camp with the spirit they now possess."
Yet many of the group experienced remarkable spiritual growth and always proclaimed the blessings that came as a result of that journey.
frequently the brethren went into the prairie or onto the high bluffs. There, clothed in temple robes, they would form a prayer circle and call upon the name of the Lord, thus bringing upon the camp many blessings.
Brigham Young called a special prayer circle on behalf of all the saints on top of these bluffs near Henry, Nebraska. Hence their name, Prayer Circle Bluffs. On Sunday, May 23, 1847, the Brethren climbed the highest of these three dramatic bluffs, known as Ancient Bluff Ruins. There, they wrote their names on a buffalo skull and placed it at the southwest corner. These well-defined trail ruts, less than half a mile east of the bluffs, show the trail the saints took through present-day Morrill County, Nebraska. They also encountered Indians, first the Pawnee and later the Sioux.
The pioneers had a lot to do with Indians, and sometimes they had trouble with Indians. Indians did steal once in a while, and they tried to kidnap some people, and they tried to trade for white wives. Yes, all of that happened. But the Indians have been given, in the vernacular, a bad rap. The other side of the story is Indians made many positive contributions towards going west. They provided guide service, they pointed out directions, they sold food, they sold clothing, and they helped Mormon stragglers and lost people. The little pioneers had to make up most of their own games and their pastime. And one thing they quickly learned was to run from one anthill to another, because the Indians, of course, lived out there and they would lose beads from their costumes. The industrious ants would pick up the beads, build them into their nest, and then the young people could pick them up, make little necklaces out of them, bracelets and trinkets, and so while away some of the long, dreary hours of trailing west.
Besides dealing with Indians, the pioneers were overwhelmed with the huge herds of bison they encountered.
While passing through the buffalo country, we did not travel fast, for all the men folks seemed to want to kill a buffalo. Mr. Rich was after a large herd. The first one he wounded, it was a very large one, and it turned upon him and came very near, killing the horse he was riding. But Mr. Rich shot again and killed the buffalo. We were several days traveling through the buffalo country. It was all that the drivers could do to prevent a stampede among our cattle. It was dangerous traveling through this country, but we were preserved from serious accident.
At Fort Laramie, Brigham's camp was joined by the Mississippi Company of Saints who had wintered at Pueblo, Colorado, with the Sikh detachment of the Mormon Battalion. Upon learning of the Sikh detachment, Brigham immediately dispatched 4 men to Pueblo to lead them forward. Throughout their journey, the Saints encountered many trials due to the tough terrain. This hill, known as Mexican Hill, is an example of some of the difficulties they faced. Impressive trail ruts lead up the hill from the east, and the hill's steep, dramatic angle caused the Saints to claim that if a tin cup fell off the back of a wagon traveling down Mexican Hill, it would land in front of the team.
These are the famous Guernsey ruts in eastern Wyoming, and as you can see today, by foot, they're rather difficult to navigate. Imagine what it would have been like driving a team of oxen up here in a wagon. These were formed in part by at least 70,000 Mormons that went this way, and of course many other hundreds of thousands of Oregonians and Californians. Now they were formed by the iron tires of the wagon and the oxen, and they did it because they were hemmed in over here by the Platte River and marshy ground, and they were hemmed in here by even worse terrain. So as bad as this looks, it was the best they could do. Now these magnificently eroded and carved out ruts, the most dramatic in the United States, perhaps the most dramatic in the world, are left behind as a great national treasure and a memorial to the hundreds of thousands of Western Americans who went out to bring civilization to the far west.
As the company pushed westward, they frequently encountered companies of Oregon-bound immigrants, many of whom had come from Missouri. Though the Saints were wary, there are no records of confrontations. and the various groups apparently worked together to help each other. For instance, on the second crossing of the Platte, near present-day Casper, Wyoming, the Mormons ferried the goods of the other immigrants over in their boat, the revenue cutter. As pay for this service, they took badly needed foodstuffs, which the Oregonians had in abundance.
After 5 days of ferrying immigrants, the Brethren decided that the ferrying business was a direct blessing of the Lord and should be continued. They therefore constructed a new ferry boat that could carry wagons and called 9 of the men to remain at the crossing, assisting both saints and emigrants in crossing the treacherous stream.
On Monday, June 21st, the camp reached Independence Rock. Wilford Woodruff and John Brown, who had arrived the night before, rode around the giant monolith, examined it, and climbed the north end, which was the highest.
We got upon this rock and offered our prayers according to the order of the priesthood. While offering up our prayers, the Spirit of the Lord descended upon us, and we truly felt to rejoice.
As the saints continued their journey, they passed many sites which became landmarks for those who followed. Emigrant Gap, Devil's Gate, and Church Butte are just a few of these well-known sites. When following the trail today, one cannot overlook Martin's Cove and the gravesite of the Willys Handcart Company, where many faithful saints tragically ended their mortal existence.
It's impossible to be here on the Mormon Trail, here in the location where the Willys Handcart Company was rescued, or in Martin Cove, where the Martin Handcart Company was rescued, without thinking of the suffering that these people went through and the dying that occurred. But as we think of that, I believe there are 2 things we ought to consider at the same time. The first is that while these 2 companies truly did suffer and were caught in the winter snows and had a horrible time, 8 other companies went through pretty much unscathed and had little difficulty in pulling their handcarts to the valley. The other thing to consider is something that Brigham Young said when he talked about suffering. All of the pioneers who pulled these trails, who rode in their wagons or who walked, who drove cattle, who suffered in any way crossing the plains, suffered to the point that that suffering was sanctifying to them. In other words, their suffering was a blessing. And we have the same kinds of experiences today. We don't walk trails and pull handcarts and suffer in that way, but in other ways we're called upon to endure the trials of life just as they were. And we suffer, and by so doing we are also sanctified and made more Christ-like in the process.
On June 27th, the camp crossed South Pass and the Continental Divide and paused at Pacific Springs, so named because its water flows westward toward the Pacific Ocean. That night, they camped on the Little Sandy, where William Clayton wrote,
"It is 3 years today since our brethren Joseph and Hiram were taken from us. And it was the general feeling to spend the day in fasting and prayer. But the Gentile companies being close in our rear and feed scarce, it was considered necessary to keep ahead with them for benefit of our teams. But many minds have reverted back to the scenes of Carthage jail, and it is a gratification that we have so far prospered in our endeavors as to get out from under the grasp of our enemies."
The next day, June 28, they met mountain man Jim Bridger, who was somewhat inebriated. Of that lengthy interview, Brigham wrote,
"Met Captain James Bridger, who said he was ashamed of Fremont's map of this country. Bridger considered it imprudent to bring a large population into the Great Basin until it was ascertained that grain could be grown. He said he would give $1,000 for a bushel of corn raised in the basin. My reply was, 'Wait, and we will show you.'"
On the afternoon of July 7th, they came to Bridger's Fort, 2 long, low, rough cabins built in the form of an L with corrals at one side. In 1855, the Mormons bought Fort Bridger, enlarged it, and built a cobblestone wall around it. Today, one small section of the wall is all that remains of the Mormon occupation here. The next day, while they rested, Wilford Woodruff got out his fishing gear and went fishing.
As soon as I had my breakfast, I rigged up my rod, which I'd brought with me from Liverpool, fixed my reel, line, and artificial fly, and went to one of the brooks close by to try my luck. A good many brethren were already at the creeks with their rods, trying their skill, baiting with fresh meat and grasshoppers, but no one was catching any. I threw my fly into the water, and it being the first time I ever tried the artificial fly in America, or ever saw it tried, I watched as it floated upon the water and was highly gratified when I saw the nimble trout dart at my fly and run away with the line. I soon worried him out and drew him to shore.
On July 9th, the company left Bridger on the dimly marked Hastings Cutoff, which followed almost exactly the route of the Union Pacific today.
Behind me are the Needles, a famous landmark on the Wyoming-Utah state line. Here it was that Brigham Young got sick in July of 1847, probably with mountain fever. He got so sick he was actually delirious. His brethren were so concerned they climbed up into the Needles and offered up prayers to the Almighty for the recovery of their president. In the meantime, not knowing how long they would be there, the rest of the company went on west to scout the trails and find their way into the valley, which they did, and they started planting the potatoes and turnips and grain and other crops for the coming winter.
On the morning of the 21st, Orson Pratt and his party crossed Little Mountain and entered Emigration Canyon, which he called Last Canyon. Desiring to explore the road, he and Erastus Snow rode ahead, thus becoming the first of the Latter-day Saints to penetrate the valley and behold the land which had been selected as their future home.
After issuing from the mountains, among which we had been shut up for many days, and beholding such an extensive scenery before us, we could not refrain from a shout of joy which almost involuntarily escaped from our lips the moment this grand, lovely scenery was within our view.
The two immediately descended into the valley, and though they had but one horse between them, they made a 12-mile circuit of the valley before they returned to their camp.
On the 22nd, the advance company made their way into the valley, and they were followed almost immediately by the second party. Making camp, they began to explore, and a dispatch was sent to Brigham. Early the next morning, the pioneers moved about 2 miles to the north of their first camp, where they unloaded their wagons and dedicated the land and themselves to the Lord.
Orson Pratt wrote,
It fell to my lot to offer up prayer and thanksgiving in behalf of our company, all of whom had been preserved from the Missouri River to this point.
The meaning of the Mormon Trail is that the Mormons sent up to 70,000 people west. We were a part of the great reconnaissance of the West. We were a vital part of Manifest Destiny. We moved as people, we moved as villages on wheels. And the interesting thing is, we didn't want to go west. Of all of the 300,000 people that went west, we did not go west for land or gold or furs or adventure or a new identity. We went west for religious freedom.
Once the land had been dedicated, the saints set about the business of planting crops. By 12 o'clock noon, the first furrow was turned by William Carter, after which George A. Smith planted the first potatoes.
Meanwhile, riding in Wilford Woodruff's comfortable carriage, Brigham came at last out of the narrow divide of Emigration Canyon and viewed the valley.
On the 24th, I drove my carriage with President Young lying on a bed in it into the open valley, the rest of the company following. When we came out of the canyon into full view of the valley, I turned the side of my carriage around, open to the west, and President Young arose from his bed and took a survey of the country. While gazing on the scene before us, he was enwrapped in vision for several minutes. He had seen the valley before in vision, and upon that occasion, he saw the future glory of Zion and Israel as they would be, planted in the valleys of the mountains. When the vision had passed, he said,
"It is enough. This is the right place. Drive on."
So I drove to the encampment, already formed by those who had come along in advance of us.